In Dull Knife's Wake by Vernon R. and Albert G. Maddux. Chapter 2, Life at Darlington. By the end of August 1878, the Cheyenne of Darlington Reservation, located in the central part of western Indian Territory, suffered two calamities, each of which had a serious and destructive effect. The first was the final eradication of the buffalo, whose decline had been evident for several years, but was now an absolute fact, at least on the southern plains. The second was the arrival of the Northern Cheyenne, which added 1,000 mouths to feed with no administrative increase in the supplemental food supply. The failure of the federal government to deliver on its commitment to the people in Indian Territory harmed not only the Cheyenne and Arapaho, but was a severe setback to the Indian Agency and adversely affected the Frontier Army as well. In August, Indian Agent John DeBrass Miles bitterly complained about the food situation to his supervisors in Washington. He wrote that the reservation was critically short of all sorts of supplies for the winter. He warned the bureaucrats that the recently arrived Northern Cheyenne were already threatening to break away and return north if they did not receive the subsistence promised them. He had only enough food supplies to feed the already settled Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho. The addition of 1,000 new mouths would cause serious shortages, with possibly tragic results, he said. He expected to run out of stored food supplies after a maximum of 9 months, but his medical supplies were already gone. Modern skeptics, as well as some critics in 1878, believed that Miles was entirely responsible for the Cheyenne's problems. Some excuse his many written protests as only demonstrations of his skill as a political animal. To his detractors, he was merely building a paper defense in case an uprising should occur. Many scholars believe the lack of adequate provisions was not Miles's fault. After all, the Quaker administrator was given a very difficult and even dangerous task, which was made worse by his government's political distractions and fierce infighting in Congress, a hangover from Reconstruction politics. As the political parties struggled in Washington, D.C., the passion to secure political power shouldered aside any real considerations for the people of the West. The situation in the federal capital could scarcely have been worse for Miles and the residents at Darlington. There had occurred a political gridlock instituted by Southern Democrats in a bold bid to regain their former power roles in Congress. Excuse me. Southern Democratic power was nearly destroyed as a political force by their armed rebellion, but was ushered back by an unfolding picture of the near-pervasive corruption of Grant's administration. The vehicle that brought back the Southerners was the 1876 presidential election. Though they would send no candidate into the White House until late in the 19th century, the Southern Democrats correctly surmised that corruption within Grant's administration had crippled the Republicans. So much harm had been wrought to the formerly invincible Republican power base that a disgruntled populace propelled former Confederate politicians, general officers, and lost cause advocates back to national prominence. Between 1870 and 1876, the Southern Democrats gained enough voter clout to battle the Republicans on even terms in the House of Representatives. When Grant left office in disgrace, the Republicans scrambled desperately to defend themselves against charges of widespread corruption and incompetence. The 1876 campaign for the White House was one of the most intense in American history and was marked by a very high voter turnout. Immediately after the election, both sides declared victory, but as the weeks stretched on, no winner could be determined, even by the end of the year. When the election was thrown to Congress to decide, the House deadlocked over voting irregularities in 2 states, Oregon and Louisiana. When the usual inauguration day in March arrived, there was still no presidential winner. In the end, the Republicans won, but only after making several important concessions. Rutherford B. Hayes became the 19th president, mostly because his party tacitly surrendered some of its political power to the Democrats. As a result, throughout Hayes' term, the federal government, meaning Congress, was nearly paralyzed. Efforts to end the political stalemate pushed the Republicans to abandon the last vestiges of Reconstruction. By 1877, they surrendered all control of race relations in the former Confederate states to the Southern Democrats. A relatively large number of former slave masters reassumed power in those states and covertly worked to restore the South to the way it had been before the war. Politically stymied, Hayes turned away from the former Republican goals of nation-building, civil rights, and reformation of the Army, and concentrated on conducting a non-aggressive regime that wooed big business. Because of the stinging rebuke of Grant's administration, Hayes took no action that might stir up any hint of scandal or corruption. The political initiative passed to the Southern Democrats, who took control of the House of Representatives, while the Republicans managed to hold on to the presidency and Senate. In the summer of 1877, the former Confederates in Congress took direct aim at an institution the South thoroughly detested, the United States Army. Even some Republicans in Congress looked down on the post-war Army, now charged with safeguarding frontier communities and Native Americans in the West. The Northern public, with its vast population of Union Army veterans, saw the Western Army as entirely different than and inferior to the one that had won the Civil War. Needless to say, the former Confederates, who suffered under the Army's heel for a decade under Grant's rule, wanted revenge. Southern Yellow Dog Democrats hated the Army for the obvious reason that many of them had spent 4 years fighting against it, and then found blue-coated soldiers reinforcing or enforcing Reconstruction rules in their hometowns after the war was over. The majority of whites in the South flatly refused to accept the fact that they had been defeated. Southerners blamed others, including the carpetbagger Northern politicians and Southern scalawag collaborators. They universally hated the fact that the Army occupied their cities and towns to enforce Republican policy. Especially troublesome to white Southerners were the Army units that were made up of former slaves. Union veterans disliked the Western Army because of its post-war character. They saw it as a low-class refuge for former slaves and shiftless foreigners. They saw the officers of the Western Army as a pack of bloody-minded, glory-hunting Indian haters. Combining these opinions with the fact that historically Americans had always abhorred standing armies, it can be said that the U.S. Army in the West had very few defenders in 1878. When the democratically dominated House of Representatives considered the 1877 budget, the Army's finances were quietly shelved while they debated more important items. For a year at a time, over the next several years, the active duty regular officers and soldiers in the Western Army worked for nothing. They were never paid. Even basic food rations and necessities, such as ammunition and weapon allowances, were drastically reduced. Out on the frontier, the Western Army did what little it could to take care of its own, at least among the officer corps. Destitute officers were permitted long sick leaves, lasting a year or more, in order to earn a living outside the garrison. However, among the enlisted ranks, no such leniency existed. Desertion rates rose to a point where even 70% of a unit being absent without authority was not unusual. Obviously, Indians living on a government-sponsored reservation suffered even more neglect than the Army, which at least had technical recourse through official channels. The scheduled shipments of medicine and food to the reservation at Darlington were never funded. The official record is clear. By January 1878, there was a complete dearth of promised annuities, food, medicine, and other basic necessities. Not even canvas for teepees was available. This caused a grave situation at Darlington. Still, most of the Cheyenne, the vast majority in fact, remained peaceful and orderly. Why most Cheyenne and Arapaho kept calm deserves some mention. One fairly obvious reason most Cheyenne stayed peaceful and remained on Darlington Reservation was that most were tired of fighting the Army, regardless of the shortage of food. No doubt many lived in the hope that the government's promises would eventually be fulfilled. Another more subtle reason was that although government food rations were chronically short on the reservation, the residents quietly developed ways of obtaining food to supplement the official dole. Surprisingly also, several Cheyenne and Arapaho actually flourished on the reservation, becoming wealthy, raising cattle and horses. Darlington Reservation in 1878 was far from the harsh, desert-like environment depicted by the movie version of Marie Sandoz's Cheyenne Autumn, or as described in Donald Worster's well-received book on Oklahoma, The Dust Bowl, The Southern Plains in the 1930s. The western lands of Indian Territory, though cleared of bison, before 1880 teemed with every other type of plains animal. Descriptions of the area by traders and cattlemen make Indian Territory resemble scenes from the lush savanna of Africa, where thousands of animals grazed across its prairies while predators lurked on their bellies in the deep, rich grass. Except for the summers of 1873 and 1878, rainfall was seasonally plentiful for the Southern Cheyenne at Darlington. Ground cover and forage existed for literally millions of game animals. In fact, the area covered by the Darlington Reservation had always been a great hunting reserve, especially for the Cherokee from the east and the Comanche, Kiowa, and later the Cheyenne from the south, west, and northwest. Furthermore, the large number of predators that dominated the area as late as 1877 seems to certify the health of the game animal population. Black bears, mountain lions, bobcats, lynx, coyotes, gray wolves, and even large badgers were reported in significant numbers practically everywhere on the reservation, as were several varieties of hunting eagles and hawks. Without question, until 1889, when large portions of the reservation were opened for settlement, a healthy game animal community existed and would have been used as food by the residents. The area was also huge, about the same size as Connecticut. It approximated a rectangle with a corner missing of about 100 miles east-west by 80 miles north-south. It contained, by government figures, more than 4 million acres. In addition to the official reserve, where the Arapaho and Cheyenne were free to camp anywhere, there was also a 70 by 200 mile strip of land called the Cherokee Outlet, which was officially closed to white ranchers but available for hunting by the Darlington residents. Not until the Cherokee made deals with the big cattle companies in the 1880s was the outlet closed to the Cheyenne Arapaho Reservation inhabitants. In 1878, it was unassigned to any tribe for settlement, and in practice available to all for hunting. Normally, when camping in the outlet, the Cheyenne kept close to the vicinity of Camp Supply, but they hunted everywhere over what is now the northwestern quarter of Oklahoma. Even though the arrival of the Northern Cheyenne increased the total population on the reserve by about 1/5 to approximately 5,000, this was still a minuscule population for such a vast area. The various bands at Darlington broke into small village groups, nearly always much less than 100 lodges. Only one chief, Little Robe, camped semi-permanently near the reservation headquarters at Concho. His was a camp with a concentrated population of widows, infirm, and the elderly, all of whom were more or less dependent on the weekly dole of food. Most of the more robust Cheyenne camped 5 to 35 miles away from Miles' office at Concho's. On average, the Cheyenne lived in groups of less than 20 lodges. At any particular time, there were probably about 20 separate Indian camps around Darlington. A census taken by Ben Clark in May 1877 indicated that there were 18 separate camps, ranging in size from Little Robe's extraordinarily large village of 179 lodges to the Plains Apache, who had 2 camps of only 2 lodges each. Little Robe's village not only contained the concentrated community of widows, orphans, infirm, and elderly, but also held a relatively large group of mixed-blood families, including the white scouts, wives, and children. There were basic reasons the residents avoided clumping together in one large super camp. Sanitation was tricky among the Plains tribes, especially in a permanent or even a temporary extra-large camp. All camps required their own reliable source of clean, free-flowing water. 4 major rivers ran through the reservation from generally northwest to southeast. These were from south to north, the Washita, Canadian, North Canadian, and the Cimarron. All usually flooded their banks in the spring and dwindled to smaller but still adequate flows in late July and August. The only exception was the extreme upper reaches of the Cimarron, which, in hot, dry summers, occasionally dried up for several miles, where it emerged from Kansas into Indian territory. Even there, though it might seem completely dry, it was famed for providing the knowledgeable scout with a pool of pure water hiding just beneath the sand. Each river took support from thousands of permanent springs, broad streams, and creeks. These rivers had added importance as a source of food because the Cheyenne were unique among the Plains tribes as fish eaters. The rivers that flowed through their new southern home had thousands of deep holes where catfish, perch, and bass could be taken year-around. The only game animal missing, and some scholars insist that this was the most critical factor in their claim that they could not find food, was the American bison. This was especially true for the Northern Cheyenne. 2 years earlier, the buffalo hunting had been excellent, even on the reservation. By 1877, however, the buffalo had practically disappeared everywhere in Indian Territory and proved very elusive in Texas and Kansas. 10 years earlier, there were an estimated 20 million bison roaming the Great Plains. In 1878, there were only a few thousand. When the Northerners arrived, they were prepared to settle permanently if they were permitted to hunt buffalo on the reservation. It became obvious to them during the very first winter, however, that buffalo hunting was non-existent in the South. In the winter hunt of 1877, hunters killed 218 buffalo after several weeks of effort. By itself, this much meat fed the Cheyenne for 1 week. Not enough robes could be obtained to repair lodges, but since most of the lodges were covered in canvas, this was no longer a critical factor. Having little material or skins available to be used for clothing was a problem, however, especially in the winter. On January 2, 1878, a 4th Cavalry detachment rode out with a hunting party, which included Pawnee, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. After several days, the officer in charge sent word back to Fort Reno that the hunt had failed to find any buffalo. The fort's commander sent a message back to the officer telling him to lead the hunters to Camp Supply, where they would receive government-procured beef rations. By the time the hunting party arrived at Camp Supply, nearly 700 Cheyenne lodges were standing around the post, the inhabitants hoping for buffalo meat. In a letter to the commander of Fort Dodge, Amos Chapman, the Camp Supply chief of scouts, complained bitterly about the lack of provisions for his wife's people. In turn, Lieutenant Colonel William H. Lewis forwarded Chapman's comments in a letter to his superiors, detailing Chapman's criticisms of Agent Miles. Chapman claimed the Cheyenne ate every horse that died of natural causes. Some ate their dogs. While Southern Cheyenne coped by switching from eating buffalo to eating beef, the Northern Cheyenne grumbled and refused to eat woha, as they termed domestic cattle. Surely on arrival, a third of the Northern Cheyenne withdrew from the rest. Surly on arrival, a third of the Northern Cheyenne withdrew from the rest and conversed and commingled only among themselves. The Southern Cheyenne shrugged at the high-mindedness of these Northern cousins. The Southerners, in comparison, were not overly concerned by the lack of supplies. After all, they knew that they had an endless source of food which continually moved across their reservation. For years, the Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho stopped all the Texas cattle companies who traveled up the Chisholm Trail through Indian Territory. From these invaders of their territory, the Cheyenne demanded a toll of beef. By 1878, the Chisholm Trail lost its importance when it was cut off by the Kansas Quarantine. Immediately, though, a new western cattle trail appeared, one even more heavily traveled than the old trail. The Southern Cheyenne took advantage of the new opportunity and approached each herd. The Indians were usually accompanied by someone fluent in English, like their friends George and Robert Bent, Amos Chapman's son, or Ben Clark. The men demanded a donation of several steers from each herd for passage through the reservation. Most cattle outfits willingly agreed and turned over a few head to maintain the peace. Those that refused occasionally became belligerent and threatened violence against the Cheyenne. They were permitted to pass without penalty for that day. In the succeeding nights, however, the Cheyenne and Arapaho took a steep toll of cattle almost always without incident. Whenever there was a standoff and an army unit was near, the Fort Reno commander would face down the Texans and back the Indians in their demands. Under the watchful eyes of a company of cavalry, the Cheyenne were permitted to cut out several head of Texas beef. This policy toward the Texas cattle drivers seemed fair, but carried political risk to both Agent Miles and to Colonel John Kemp Misner, the Fort Reno commander, Colonel John Kemp Misner. The Army came under much criticism for backing the Cheyenne. Many Texans growled that this was another Yankee traitorous act against Southern whites. On one occasion, Miles ordered an entire herd of about 1,000 cattle confiscated, driven to Camp Supply, and butchered. Miles used the beef to feed the Cheyenne and Arapaho. The cattle, owned by a group of Texans, had strayed illegally from Kansas down into Indian Territory to graze. Although Miles got into trouble with his superiors for taking the cattle, those animals fed the Darlington residents for several weeks. Unrest among the Cheyenne in 1877, before the Northern Cheyenne arrived in the South, had been relatively minor. Some incidents occurred, but there were no serious disturbances. Most of the Southern Cheyenne realized that life outside the reservation without buffalo herds or open ranges was impractical. But the Northern Cheyenne saw things differently. The tiny minority of Northerners demanded extraordinary power from the tribal council. When the council refused, the Northern Cheyenne confronted Miles and the Southern chiefs by demanding that all young Cheyenne men leave the reservation and head north. The antagonism and belligerency and warlike activities of the Northern Cheyenne caused the dormant Southern Cheyenne Dogmen Warrior Society to reorganize. They gathered protectively and met to counter claims that they were weak and had become pawns of the whites. Deeply insulted and disturbed, they spat back, derisively calling the Northerners Sioux Cheyenne. When DullKnife arrived at Darlington from the Red Cloud Agency, he and Little Wolf scoffed openly at the Southern Dogmen, sneering at their lack of fighting prowess. American Horse, a Northern Cheyenne who came south in the large group with DullKnife and Little Wolf, related the following to Agent Miles. DullKnife was at Fort Reno only a short time until he began fomenting trouble. He claimed the water and grass were no good, and the agent was stealing his chuck away, his food rations, and his family and friends were famishing. Little Wolf persuaded a few young warriors to scout the route back to the north, and Miles found out that they had left too late to stop them. From late 1877 and all through 1878, small groups of warriors, 3 or 4 at a time, slipped away from the reservation and headed up the trail toward the north country. Even groups of families risked leaving the reservation. The first attempt, 1877, was by a small band of Cheyenne, and they made a successful getaway. In the course of time, they reached their friends in the Dakotas who had been allowed to stay in their ancestral lands and were made welcome. In Montana, some of these men were absorbed into Two Moons Cheyenne, who who were allowed to stay temporarily at Fort Keogh, Montana Territory. Others made their way to the Sioux camps at Pine Ridge and Standing Rock in South Dakota Territory. A few were caught and returned. In late July 1878, DullKnife went to John Miles and said that Army officers at Fort Robinson had assured him that he could return north again if he became dissatisfied with Darlington. This was news to the Indian agent. Miles responded to DullKnife that military officers had no right to say such things. Unabashed, DullKnife continued in this manner. He expressed unhappiness with the prescribed limits to their freedom inside the reservation. He disliked the proximity and attitude of the Army troops who patrolled outside their camp. DullKnife asserted that his band was dying from the measles epidemic in the spring, coupled with a high infant mortality. The agency doctor was useless to the Cheyenne because he had no medicine. Miles refuted DullKnife's assertion that the Northerners could leave when they wanted. The agent did promise to write his superiors for more supplies, especially medicine. Little Wolf, who accompanied DullKnife at all the meetings with Miles, said little during the meetings. Later, he wrote a letter to a congressional committee. George Grinnell believed the letter was the work of George Bent, a friend to the Northern Cheyenne. A great many have been sick, and some have died. I have been sick a great deal of the time since I have been down here, homesick and heartsick, and sick in every way. I have been thinking of my native country and the good home I had up there, where I was never hungry, but when I wanted anything to eat, I could go out and hunt buffalo. It makes me feel sick when I think about it, and I cannot help thinking about that. Persistent hunger for buffalo meat soon decreased in importance when horse thieves struck the reservation herds. On January 20, 1878, 30 destitute Cheyenne men, women, and children appeared at the gates to Camp Supply, having been robbed of their 26 horses. Deputy marshals searched the hills and ravines around the camp to no avail. The herd appeared in Dodge City, 70 miles north of Camp Supply, where buyers offered a no-questions-asked market for horses stolen from the Indians. The horse-stealing issue prompted DullKnife, Little Wolf, and Wild Hog, resident chief of the Northern Cheyenne Dogmen, to become lightning rods for the disaffected. As the Northerners' influence expanded to its maximum, their only real opposition came from wealthier Cheyenne and Arapaho, who owned large herds of cattle and horses. Having much to lose, these men feared what would happen if the disaffected Northern Cheyenne disturbed the peace by either attacking cattlemen or fleeing the reservation. These wealthy cattle and horsemen worked closely with the cavalry, but had limited protection. To police the southern two-thirds of Darlington, 2 companies of 4th Cavalry spent most of their time in the field. Effectively, the fort had about 100 cavalrymen available to guard 5,000 Indians. Since the residents had the right to camp anywhere on the 4 million acres, this meant the troops spent almost every night on the ground, rain or snow. Desertion was rampant among the soldiers. In practice, about 70 men and 4 or 5 officers patrolled the gigantic area. Because they were so short-handed, the soldiers spent every night in the field, sometimes with their barracks at Fort Reno visible on the horizon. For weeks and months at a time, the 4th Cavalry rode all day and sent out patrols at night, the off-duty sleeping in full uniform on the ground in a thin bedroll. On one occasion that spring, DullKnife deliberately tested the Army to see how it would respond. After spreading and encouraging rumors that his group intended to leave, the wily old chief tore down the village one night and slipped far to the north, where he camped just outside the reservation in the Cherokee Outlet. Major Misner ordered the cavalry to find the Cheyenne and bring them back. After a day or so, scouts found the village. When the soldiers rode into the camp, the armed troopers turned outward in the middle of the camp. With their rifles pointing at the Cheyenne, the officer in charge informed DullKnife that all his food rations would be withheld until the Indians moved back to the reservation. DullKnife complied and signaled his people to move the camp back south. In another instance, Cheyenne scouts informed Agent Miles that Little Wolf had ordered 3 young men to leave the reservation and to ride north as advance scouts. Miles found Little Wolf and demanded an explanation as to the disappearance of the men. Wild Hog and Old Crow appeared with Little Wolf. Wild Hog claimed he had no control over individual unmarried warriors. Little Wolf refused to admit anything. He flatly refused to send out a recall for the missing men. Frustrated, Miles made the situation worse by threatening to imprison 10 Cheyenne men as hostages unless the 3 missing braves returned. Little Wolf spoke quietly. He said he was insulted and dishonored by the demand, feeling he had no way to comply. The Quaker agent, argumentative and personally threatening each chief, insisted. Wild Hog spoke. He told Miles that from that day peace was finished. Little Wolf stepped between the men and told Miles that not only would he, Little Wolf, take his people north, but the army did not frighten him. He would fight if the army tried to stop him. Miles stepped back. Although he proved to be a courageous and determined man, Miles was stunned by the open defiance. When the chiefs left, he had no idea what to do next, so he did nothing. The next morning, the camps of Little Wolf, Wild Hog, and DullKnife had vanished. Awakened by the news, Miles grew alarmed at the report of the missing Northerners. In the pre-dawn darkness, the agent concluded that Little Wolf had carried out his threat to leave. Sending a rider across the North Canadian River to Fort Reno, he asked Misner to send a courier to Camp Supply, warning them that the Cheyenne were missing. He hoped they could stop them on the reservation. Fort Reno reacted in near panic, and soon messengers were racing across the prairies in several directions, and the telegraph was hot with the news. In fact, DullKnife and the Northern Cheyenne camped 20 miles north of Concho. When a scout found them later that morning, they were camped near Jesse Chisholm's grave in the North Canadian River Valley. Their camp was in a shady grove across from a sacred sun dance ritual site called Red Bluff. That night, the Cheyenne police returned to Concho with news that DullKnife had not left the reservation. Little Wolf spoke the truth, however. Preparations to flee progressed, and they felt unready to leave, not just yet. For several nights, by the light of skunk fires, young men and women danced. The disaffected Cheyenne met with the other Cheyenne leaders in council. Among DullKnife's followers, the chiefs debated the best course to follow in leaving the reservation. DullKnife advised extreme caution, but Wild Hog and Little Wolf were inflexible, demanding that the people prepare to leave right away and get ready to fight the army. DullKnife polled the common warriors for their views. On the third night, DullKnife announced his decision, and all agreed. They would leave within the week. The next morning, some of the Northerners informed their southern relatives that a decision had been made to go north. Among the army, confusion reigned. Only one day after the first courier arrived with the word that the Northerners had fled, a second messenger rode into Camp Supply and announced that it had been another false alarm. Exactly a week after creating the second false alarm, DullKnife's Cheyenne were ready to leave. They had delayed primarily for lack of horses. The officer in charge of the cavalry guarding the Northerners, Captain Joseph Rindlebrock, watched helplessly as the Cheyenne prepared to leave, knowing full well what they were doing. His pleas for direct action to stop them fell on deaf ears. Misner ordered Rindlebrock to stay out of the camp in the daytime and at night, to move beyond sight of the camp. On the night the Cheyenne left, Rindlebrock camped 4 miles away so as not to frighten the Cheyenne. With 2 companies of cavalry too far away to bother them, the Northerners dug up and distributed their caches of weapons and ammunition. That evening, the Cheyenne leaders dispatched young boys who carried valued possessions in exchange for extra ammunition and food. At the same time, other enterprising young men slipped out and moved on foot toward the horse herds of the Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho. Their mission was to capture and bring back the best horses. When it grew totally dark, women in DullKnife's camp removed their lodge covers and packed them on the pack animals, leaving the bare poles pointing up into the clear, moonless sky. Large campfires flared into the night blackness, highlighting the naked lodge poles standing like a series of skeletons, ghostly in the flickering glare. By midnight, pemmican bags bulged full, and all camp gear was packed on the animals. Old rifles and muskets were cleaned, oiled, and loaded. DullKnife's personal weapon, an ancient tower muzzle-loader, flashed its brass fittings in the firelight. Forgetting the turmoil of the past months, united in their tasks, DullKnife Cheyenne were transformed into a happy and busy people. After weeks of sitting idle in their lodges, awaiting the next handout, dogmen and crooked lance warriors established camp discipline, refusing to let anyone in or out without their permission. New mothers, such as Buffalo Calf Road, packed their baby boards onto waiting horses. A few small children climbed up onto ponies behind their parents. The sounds of hooves quieted, and the camp grew still. Everyone paused and looked toward the center of the camp, where Little Wolf and Wild Hog stood by their horses conversing. Everyone knew that the 4th Cavalry and its 2 Prussian captains were all that stood in the way of them going north. The 65-year-old DullKnife leaped gracefully onto the back of his horse, ready to lead the way as one of 2 forward scouts. He kicked his horse, rode out of the light, and headed toward the North Canadian River. The waiting had ended. For better or worse, DullKnife's people were going home. End of Chapter 2. In DullKnife's Wake by Vernon R. and Albert G. Maddux.